have to tell you about something that happened to me when I was younger, something that changed my village forever. We lived in a small, quiet place surrounded by endless fields of corn. These cornfields stretched as far as you could see, with tall stalks that swayed in the wind. Everyone in the village worked in those fields, planting, growing, and harvesting the corn. It was just part of our daily life, and nothing strange ever happened there, until one night. I was walking home from a friend's house one evening after the sun had set, and the sky was turning dark. My path led me right by the cornfield just like always, but that night things felt different. The wind was blowing, making the corn stalks rustle, but I could swear I heard something else too. It was like someone was whispering my name. Zane. Zane? The voice was so soft that I thought it might just be the wind playing tricks on me. I stopped and looked around, trying to see if anyone was there. The cornfield stretched out on both sides, dark and silent except for that soft rustling. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off and kept walking. Then I heard it again, louder this time. Zane. Come here. My heart started to beat faster and I picked up my pace, wanting to get home as quickly as possible. When I got home, I told my parents what I had heard. They listened carefully, but then my dad just smiled and said, "It's probably just the wind, Zane. There's nothing to worry about." But I could see a flicker of concern in his eyes, like maybe he wasn't so sure. The next day, I told my friends about the voice in the cornfield. Some of them laughed and said I was trying to scare them, but a few looked worried. They admitted that they had heard strange noises in the cornfield too. Whispers, footsteps, even sounds like someone crying. We started to get scared. What if there really was something in the cornfield? That night, a group of us decided we had to find out what was going on. We grabbed some flashlights and met at the edge of the cornfield. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the field, but the corn stalks made it hard to see anything. We walked slowly into the field, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The corn swayed around us, making that soft rustling sound that now sent shivers down my spine. Then we heard it. A faint whisper like before, calling my name. Zane. Come closer. The voice seemed to be coming from deeper in the cornfield. We looked at each other, fear clear on everyone's face, but we kept moving forward, our hearts pounding. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Zane, help me. Suddenly, one of my friends let out a scream. I swung my flashlight in his direction and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing between the corn stalks was a shadowy figure, tall and thin. It looked like a person but wasn't. Its face was just darkness, with no eyes or mouth, and its body seemed to blend into the night, like it was made of shadows. The figure reached out a hand, pointing straight at me. Help me, the figure whispered, its voice sounding like the wind, sad and lonely. We were frozen with fear, unable to move. The figure started to step toward us, slowly, and that's when we all broke out of our trance and ran. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back in the village, our hearts pounding and breaths coming in ragged gasps. We told the adults what we saw, and they looked more worried than I had ever seen them. The village chief, an old woman with wise eyes, said she had heard stories about a ghost in the cornfield. She said that many years ago, a girl named Lena had gone missing in the field and was never found. Some people believed her spirit still wandered the field, lost and looking for help. The next day, the chief gathered everyone in the village, and we decided we had to help Lena's spirit find peace. We all went to the cornfield together, holding candles and saying prayers. The chief led us to the spot where we had seen the shadowy figure, and there, lying on the ground, we found an old, broken locket. It was covered in dirt, but when we cleaned it off, we saw the name Lena engraved on it. The chief said a special prayer, and we buried the locket under a large tree at the edge of the cornfield. As we did, a gentle breeze blew through the corn, making the stalks sway softly. For a moment, it felt like the wind was whispering, "Thank you." After that night, the strange whispers stopped, and we never saw the shadowy figure again. The cornfield went back to being just a cornfield, quiet and peaceful. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I think I can still hear a faint whisper, like Lena's voice saying, "Thank you for helping me." Every time I walk by that tree at the edge of the field, I remember the ghost in the cornfield and the night that changed everything in our village. Before we dive into the next spine-chilling tale, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification button. That way you won't miss out on any of our spooky stories. We'll be sharing more scary stories regularly, so stay tuned. Let me tell you about something that happened in my village a long time ago, something I'll never forget. It all started with the well. You see, in the middle of our village there was this old ancient well right next to a big tree. This wasn't just any well, it was so deep that if you dropped a pebble in, you wouldn't hear it hit the water for a long time. Everyone used that well for water, drinking, cooking, bathing. It had always been safe, or so we thought. One night, when the moon was full and shining bright in the sky, a terrible scream came from the well. It was so loud that it woke me up from my sleep, heart racing. I thought I was having a nightmare, but then I realized it was real. The whole village heard it. We all rushed out of our houses, lanterns in hand, faces pale with fear. I remember standing there, shivering even though it was a warm night. The scream sounded like someone, or something, was trapped down there, and it was desperate to get out. The village chief, an old man with a long white beard, called everyone together. He said, "Something is in the well. We have to find out what it is." He looked around and his eyes settled on Raj, the bravest man in the village. Raj was strong, always willing to help anyone in trouble. He nodded and walked over to the well. I watched as he leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. Then Raj stumbled back, his face white as snow. "There's a monster in the well," he shouted. I saw its eyes. They're glowing red and they're watching us. A chill ran down my spine. Everyone started talking at once, fear spreading like wildfire. The chief decided we needed to cover the well with a big, heavy stone. Maybe, he said, if we sealed it, whatever was down there couldn't get out. So we all worked together, pushing the stone until it covered the well completely. For a few days, everything was quiet. We started to feel safe again. We thought we had trapped the monster inside. But then, on another full moon night, the same horrible scream filled the air, even louder this time. It was so loud it made the ground shake under my feet. I rushed out of my house to see the stone on the well cracking. Something was pushing against it from inside. I watched in horror as the stone moved inch by inch, until it toppled over with a loud crash. Out of the well crawled a dark, shadowy figure. It was taller than any man, with long, twisted arms and claws that looked sharp enough to cut through anything. Its red eyes glowed in the darkness, and it let out a growl that made my blood run cold. The monster started to move toward us, and we all ran, screaming, back to our houses. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The monster roared and howled outside, shaking the trees and rattling the windows. It was angry, furious that it had been trapped, and it wanted revenge. The village chief knew we had to do something. He remembered an old story his grandfather used to tell him, about a hero who could defeat any monster with a special magic stone. The stone was supposed to be hidden in the forest, guarded by an old owl. The chief gathered a few of us, including Raj and me, and we ran into the forest, desperate to find the stone. The forest was dark, filled with shadows and strange noises. My hands were shaking, but I knew we had to find the stone. We searched for what felt like hours until we saw a big old owl sitting on a branch. The owl looked at us with wise eyes and said, "I know what you're looking for. The stone you need is under the big oak tree. But be careful, the monster will try to stop you." We found the big oak tree and started digging beneath it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Finally, we found the magic stone. It was glowing softly, even in the dark forest. Just as we picked it up, a terrible roar echoed through the trees. The monster had found us. It lunged at us, its claws ready to strike, but Raj held up the magic stone. A bright light shot out from the stone and the monster froze. It let out a horrible, ear-splitting scream and began to melt away, turning into a dark mist. The mist swirled around us, then vanished into the night. We had done it. We had defeated the monster. We ran back to the village and placed the magic stone inside the well to keep the monster away forever. From that night on, the well was quiet. No more screams, no more glowing red eyes. The village was safe again. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I think I can still hear a faint whisper coming from the well, like a warning, reminding us of the monster that once lived there. And we always keep the magic stone close, just in case the monster ever decides to come back. I grew up in a small village where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever happened that was out of the ordinary. But there was one place in the village that no one ever talked about, the old manor on the hill. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, its once grand structure now crumbling and covered in ivy. The windows were shattered, and the doors hung off their hinges as if the house itself was trying to keep people away. As kids, we were always told to stay away from the manor. The adults said it was cursed, that anyone who went inside would never be the same again. They whispered about strange noises, shadows that moved on their own, and a mysterious figure that sometimes appeared in the windows. But of course, that just made us more curious. One summer, when I was about 15, my friends and I decided we were going to find out the truth about the old manor. We'd heard all the stories, but none of us believed in ghosts or curses. So one evening, just before sunset, we made our way up the hill. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, and the wind whispered through the trees, making the leaves rustle like they were trying to warn us. The manor loomed above us, dark and foreboding. As we approached, the temperature seemed to drop, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. We pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The interior was just as decayed as the outside, dust-covered furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and a thick layer of grime on everything. But it wasn't the state of the house that unnerved me. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. "Let's split up and look around," my friend Amir suggested. He was always the bravest of us, or maybe just the most reckless. We agreed and started exploring different parts of the manor. I headed upstairs, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. The second floor was even creepier than the first. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking people, their eyes following me as I moved down the hallway. I reached the end of the corridor where a door stood slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in dust. But as I wiped away the grime, I felt a chill in the air. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine, it was someone else's. The face staring back at me was that of a young woman, her eyes wide with fear. She was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair disheveled and her face pale as death. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but when I looked around, the room was empty. My hands were shaking as I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, I heard a soft, pleading voice. "Help me, please." I spun around, but the room was still empty. The voice came again, desperate and full of sorrow. "I'm trapped." I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The mirror began to fog up, and words appeared on its surface, written in a trembling hand. "Find the key, break the curse." My friends called out from downstairs, snapping me out of my trance. I ran back to them, my mind racing. I told them what I'd seen, but they just laughed, thinking I was trying to scare them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the mirror was real, and that she was in danger. Determined to uncover the truth, I convinced my friends to help me search the manor for this key. We scoured every room but found nothing unusual until we reached the basement. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. In the far corner, half buried under rubble, we found an old, rusted chest. Inside was a small, intricately designed key, its metal cold and heavy in my hand. Just as I held the key up, the temperature in the room plummeted. The door slammed shut behind us, and we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere above us. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. My friends and I huddled together, fear gripping us. Then we heard her voice again, closer this time, filled with urgency. "You found it? Now free me." We rushed back upstairs, guided by the voice, which led us to a hidden door behind one of the portraits. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow, winding staircase that led to a small attic. There, bathed in the pale light of the setting sun, was the mirror. The woman's reflection was clearer now, and she was crying, her hands pressed against the glass as if it were a prison. "Use the key, hurry," she begged. With trembling hands, I approached the mirror and inserted the key into a small, almost invisible keyhole at its base. As I turned the key, a loud, ear-splitting crack filled the room, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The woman's figure dissolved into a wisp of smoke that swirled around us before disappearing. But as the smoke cleared, something else began to take shape. A dark, shadowy figure, more sinister than anything we had imagined. The curse hadn't been lifted, it had been released. The figure lunged at us with a chilling wail, its eyes burning with rage. We scrambled to get out of the attic, our hearts pounding in our chests. As we fled the manor, the entire building began to shake, as if it were alive and trying to pull us back inside. We didn't stop running until we were safely back in the village, breathless and terrified. In the days that followed, the old manor crumbled to the ground, reduced to nothing but a pile of rubble. The villagers said it was the curse finally being broken, but I knew the truth. The curse hadn't been broken at all, it had just been set free. And now it was out there, somewhere waiting. To this day, I can still hear the woman's voice in my nightmares, begging me to help her, and the dark figure's eyes, burning with anger as it was unleashed upon the world. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if it will ever come back to finish what it started. Let me tell you about something truly terrifying that happened to me when I was a kid. It's a story I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. You see, in our village, there was a river that flowed quietly past the fields and houses. It wasn't a big river, but it was wide enough that you couldn't jump across, and deep enough that you couldn't see the bottom. During the day, it was a peaceful place where kids would play and splash around, but at night, it was a different story. One evening, my friends and I were playing by the river. We were skipping stones, seeing who could throw theirs the farthest. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was getting late, but none of us wanted to go home yet. That's when we heard it, a soft humming sound coming from the other side of the river. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but then the humming turned into a voice singing softly. We stopped what we were doing and listened. It was a woman's voice, gentle and sweet, singing a lullaby that I'd never heard before. We looked at each other, curious but also a little scared. The river was too wide to see clearly to the other side, especially in the dimming light, but we could make out a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the water. "Who's that?" my friend Ollie whispered. None of us knew. The figure didn't move, just stood there singing the soft, sad song. Then, almost as if it sensed us watching, the singing stopped. The figure turned its head towards us. Even from across the river, I could feel its eyes on me. My heart started pounding and a shiver ran down my spine. "We should go," I said, trying to sound brave, but my voice was shaky. My friends nodded and we turned to leave. Just as we took a few steps away, the voice started again, this time calling out. "Wait, don't go." It was still soft and sweet, but now there was something else in it, something that made my skin crawl. We froze in our tracks, looking back at the river. The figure was moving closer to the water, still humming. I could see it more clearly now, a woman with long dark hair, her dress flowing like mist around her. But something about her wasn't right. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the dark, and her eyes were dark, empty holes. She stepped into the river, and the water didn't make a sound as it moved around her. "Come closer. Help me," she said, stretching out her hand. It was as if the river itself was carrying her voice to us. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Part of me wanted to run, but another part was drawn to that voice like it was pulling me in. I took a small step forward, and so did my friends. "Stop!" a voice shouted from behind us. We all turned to see an old man from the village, Mr. Hassan, running toward us, his face pale and terrified. He grabbed my arm, yanking me back from the riverbank. "Get away from there," he shouted. We stumbled back, my heart racing as Mr. Hassan pulled us away from the river. When we looked back, the woman was gone. The river was quiet again, just a dark ribbon flowing through the night. "What were you doing?" Mr. Hassan scolded us, his voice shaking. "Don't you know the stories? The spirit of the river calls out on nights like this. It lures people in, then pulls them under. Many years ago, a woman drowned here and her spirit never left. She wanders the riverbank, searching for someone to join her in the water." We all stared at him, wide-eyed. We had heard stories about ghosts and spirits before, but we never thought they were real. Mr. Hassan led us back to the village, warning us never to go near the river at night again. "She's always waiting," he said, "always watching for someone to pull into her world." After that night, none of us ever went near the river after dark. Even during the day when we played by the water, we were careful not to get too close to the edge. But sometimes when the wind blew just right, I could still hear that soft, sweet humming calling out from across the river. And every time I did, a shiver would run down my spine, and I'd remember the ghost of the riverbank, waiting for the next person to answer her call. I'll never forget the time I visited my grandfather's village, a place so remote that it felt like stepping into another world. The village was small, nestled deep within a dense forest, and it had a strange, eerie quietness to it, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the village, but there was one story he never told me. I had to learn that one for myself. It was during my first night there that I noticed something was off. The villagers were friendly during the day, but as soon as the sun began to set, they hurried to their homes, locking their doors and windows. The village, which had been so lively in the daylight, became a ghost town at night. When I asked my grandfather about it, he just told me to stay inside after dark and not to ask questions. But I was young and my curiosity got the better of me. That night, after my grandfather had gone to bed, I decided to find out what the villagers were so afraid of. I waited until the house was silent, then quietly slipped out into the night. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy of trees above. As I walked through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The village, which had been so silent, now seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible sound, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. I kept walking, drawn by a strange, magnetic pull toward the heart of the village. That's when I saw it. In the middle of the village square stood an old, weathered well. It looked ancient, its stones covered in moss, and it was surrounded by a ring of dead, withered plants. There was something deeply unsettling about it, but I couldn't look away. I approached the well, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I peered over the edge, I felt a sudden chill, as if the air around me had dropped several degrees. The well was deep, so deep that I couldn't see the bottom. But then I heard it, coming from the darkness below, a soft, rhythmic sound almost like a heartbeat. Thump thump, thump thump. It was slow, deliberate, and it echoed up from the depths, sending a shiver down my spine. My heart began to race as the sound grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was down there was getting closer. I backed away from the well, my hands trembling, but before I could turn to run, I heard a voice, soft, melodic, and utterly hypnotic. Help me. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was coming from the well, from deep within its darkness. It was a woman's voice, pleading, desperate. Please, help me. Against my better judgment, I moved closer, my curiosity battling with my fear. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky. The voice responded, I'm trapped, so cold, please. I hesitated, my mind racing. It could have been a trick, some kind of illusion, but the desperation in her voice felt real. I looked around, but the village was still deserted. No one was coming to help. It was just me and the well. Taking a deep breath, I leaned over the edge and called down, How can I help you? For a moment, there was only silence. Then the voice spoke again, Lower the bucket, please. I spotted the old rusty crank on the side of the well and slowly began to lower the bucket. The sound of the rope unraveling echoed in the stillness, and the heartbeat sound from below grew louder, quicker, as if the well itself was alive. Suddenly, the crank jerked in my hands as if something had grabbed the bucket from below. I nearly let go, but I held on, struggling to pull it back up. It felt heavier than it should have, like I was lifting something far more than just water. The heartbeat sound was deafening now, pounding in my ears, and the voice was no longer soft. It was screaming, Help me, help me, let me out. With one final heave, I yanked the bucket up and over the edge of the well. But what came out wasn't water, it was a hand. A pale, cold, bony hand gripping the edge of the bucket with claw-like fingers. I stumbled back in horror as the rest of the figure emerged from the well, a woman or what was left of her. Her skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over her bones, and her eyes were hollow, dark voids. Her hair hung in wet, matted clumps, and she was soaked from head to toe, water dripping from her ragged clothes. She was nothing more than a corpse, yet she moved with a terrifying, unnatural speed. She lunged at me, her mouth opening in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, but I could hear her behind me, her footsteps slapping against the cobblestones as she chased me through the village. I didn't stop until I was back at my grandfather's house, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, my body shaking with fear. Outside, the night was silent again as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The next morning, I told my grandfather what had happened. His face turned pale, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. He told me that the well was cursed, that it was once a sacred place where villagers would make offerings to keep the spirits at bay. But one night, many years ago, a woman had thrown herself into the well, her heart filled with despair. Her spirit had been trapped there ever since, angry and vengeful, luring anyone foolish enough to come close. We left the village that day and I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sound of her voice, whispering in the darkness, pleading for help. And I know that the curse of the old well is still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to lower the bucket and release her wrath.